Welcome back. You're watching The Fix. Joining me now to continue the conversation is Sunday Times columnist Peter Prus. Peter, good evening.
Hello, Karima. Nice to be back again. How are you?
Yes, I'm good,
Excellent.
man. How are you?
Excellent, yeah. Tembeka, you were interesting talking to Karima. You talk about how the ANC might get itself bogged down the more it tries to take control of the process of making a decision, rather. And I wondered whether whether you didn't really have a strong point there, because once you try and put words into the Constitution, you might actually narrow the definition under which things might be expropriated, rather than the rather wide definition that now exists, which is pretty much anything that is equitable and just.
Yes. No, I mean, I think that there is a risk of making an amendment that will ultimately slow down land reform, because the focus has been on a narrow provision in the Constitution, Section 25 2 sub B. And the way that the amendment will look like, it will be an insertion of words into that provision, which then means that the courts will have to scrutinize in relation to each and every expropriation decision what the meaning of those words are.
Yeah.
And those courts, those judges that might be inclined to protect property rights will obviously narrow the definition. And so if you currently look at the model that we currently have, which is a flexible model, it gives the courts a wider scope to be creative about remedies. And hence, we've been arguing that the constitutional framework gives you enough flexibility to pass legislation.
When you say we, who's we?
Well, I have been one of the activists arguing.
And do you get listened to? I mean, do ministers sit in front of you and nod their heads? And
he was at the land summit of the ANC that they were held. He made an input. That is the weird thing that I can't understand.
Last Tuesday night, when the president appeared and suddenly makes a statement, I mean, what did you think? Were you surprised?
Well, firstly, I wasn't watching. I only saw it the following day. So when I did see it the following day, I thought it was rather surprising.
But Tembeka, I wanted to pick up on something. I mean, I've chatted with you about this process, and you've not just been an advocate for land reform, you've also sometimes adjudicated cases, right, as an acting judge. The president says here, accordingly, the ANC will, through a parliamentary process, finalize a proposed amendment to the Constitution that outlines more clearly the conditions under which expropriation of land without compensation can be effected. You've argued that there has been some who fetishized the Constitution and used it as a way to defer, in fact, land reform, saying that it's untouchable. I mean, is this not harmless enough? I mean, is this not really necessary, considering the fact that there's so many different interpretations, or is the ultimate thing to actually just bring the bloody case?
Yes. Look, there's the point we've been trying to debate here is, I mean, the principle is the correct principle, because it is intended at bringing about a speedier way in which land reform will be done. But the problem is that there is a difficulty with the focus. Our problem in South Africa is land reform. Our problem in South Africa is not the Constitution. Our problem in South Africa is not the law. So we've got a problem with land reform. So we've got to focus on what are the things that are prohibiting land reform? What are the things that are making land reform difficult? President Ramaphosa announced at the beginning of his presidency that he would be using what he called evidence-based policies. So what does the evidence tell us? And the only evidential piece we have is from the Motlanthe panel. And it tells us what the problems are with the land reform. So any legal solutions that you design should be rationally connected to the evidence that you have in front of you. So what we know from the Motlanthe panel is we've got a problem of corruption. We've got a problem of bureaucracy. We've got a problem of the failure by the state to carry out its constitutional mandate. So fixing those things has very little to do with the constitutional framework. So the outcome of this is that
the Motlanthe report under the bus, having gone to see King Zwelithini to promise him that he wouldn't touch the trust lands, which necessarily would have to fall into any equation. when you really think about it, you know, how many years, as you say, will it take for a black person to access a piece of land that now might belong to a white one through a legal process? Because there's so much corruption.
Yes.
You know, if the Sunday Times lead today
Yes.
was about how a whole lot of cattle intended for small farmers had ended up in Nkandla with Jacob Zuma and various other tribal leaders and kings. And if we can't distribute cattle without stealing them, can you imagine what the ANC would do with, you know, thousands of millions of acres of hectares of land?
Yeah, and that point touches upon another crucial part of the debate that I feel sometimes is overlooked, which is that we have to fix the institutions responsible for land reform. Because even if, for argument's sake, we accept that there is a constitutional amendment, whether it's wide or narrow, whether the categories are narrow or it applies to everything, without effective institutions to implement land reform will remain a dream. Currently, we know from the Motlanthe panel that the institutions are weak, the institutions are corrupt, the institutions are over-bureaucratized. And there is no current legislative proposal on how to fix the institutions.
Let's take a listen, gentlemen, to the IFP's objection. And there's a particular reason why I want to play this part, because, of course, they have multitudes of reasons for opposing this. But let's have a listen quickly.
The government must release the land under its control to the people. And thereafter, we must go to the land audit. There is land that is under the control of the minority people, which we must audit. And that particular land, some of the land will have to be expropriated with compensation, but the land that is not being utilized will have to be considered as to what are the possibilities of distributing that land to the people.
Now, of course, distributing the land to the people, the point that Peter's making, how are we going to ensure that land actually ends up in the hands of black people, either via title deeds, via security of tenure, and an actual redistribution? What other instruments, institutional instruments, do you actually require when we've already established that the Constitution actually allows you to do that, Tembeka?
Yeah. So, I mean, Ronald Lamola made a promising comment when he was explaining the decision by the ANC, which was that the intention is that the land will be transferred to the people. And that's consistent with the Freedom Charter, and that's consistent with the Constitution. And so the idea that there is certain pieces of land that will be excluded from the scope of expropriation is itself contrary to the provisions of the Constitution. But also the second thing that Lamola, I think, addressed, which actually was crucial, was the idea that the ultimate beneficiaries of the land will be the people. And that's important because part and parcel of the colonial and apartheid infrastructure was the consolidation of power in the chiefs. And the consolidation of political power came with the consolidation of control over land. And the promise of the Constitution was to break that stranglehold so that power truly belongs to the people and control over land belongs to the people. So that's a crucial element, is that the scope of the beneficiaries will be the people and not the chiefs. But then the second part of this idea is that what institutions do you put in place? For instance, do you allow the Ingonyama Trust to continue existing in its current format? And what we know is that there has already been an announcement, essentially, that it will be excluded, which is problematic at two levels. The first was that it's a disempowering statement because it disempowers the people living under Ingonyama Trust, and it's contrary to the vision of the Freedom Charter that the power belongs to the people. But it's also disconcerting in another level. The process of consultations is still ongoing. Who knows what the people will say about Ingonyama Trust, that the president can make an announcement prematurely that this land will not be touched. So the scope needs to be opened and everything should be up for play so that once the parliamentary process is finished, it's possible to then narrow down the categories, but to do it, in a sense, preemptively, I think then renders the current hearings a bit of a farce.
Peter, you've been very generous with the president, and you've always reminded us that he's got a very narrow way in which to work. You've written a column this week about land. What do you think was on his mind? Do you think he feels checkmated by the EFF on this matter?
No, I don't think he feels checkmated. I think he feels pressed and hurried along by his NEC. Who themselves may be panicking, and I don't know what they're panicking about, to be quite honest. But he wants to, you know, everything that Cyril Ramaphosa does has got the next year's election in mind. And what worries me about what he did today was to instead of having the open conversation about the Constitution that we probably should have, he's turned it into a sort of a weapon to solve a populist problem. And, you know, the danger of that is that it sets a precedent for the next president to you know, next time he comes along, well, we don't have enough schools with water tanks on them, or we'll go to the Constitution and solve it, you know, and we need to be very careful of that. But I can't help thinking, listening to Tembeka talking, that this is going to last a very long time, and not just 1 or 2 years, but 1 or 2, 3 or 4 presidencies before. You know, before it gets done, if it's going to get done peacefully and legally and constitutionally.
Now, Tembeka, I know you act for the EFF quite often, right? But Julius Malema has been encouraging a lawless approach to the issue of land redistribution. Is that something that you encourage? Is that something that you think is inevitable because of the ineptness of the government and the fact that it's now just become a football?
Yes. I mean, if the issue is around the sort of land occupations, I mean, there's currently an ongoing case about land occupations, and unfortunately, I represent him in that particular case. But I've got general views to be made about land occupations, right? The current legal framework around land occupations says that not every land occupation should be visited with the police. And it must always be decided by a court applying the standard of justice and equity. So the consequence is that some land occupations will in fact be deemed effectively to be legal, and they will not be reversed by the police. But I want to come back to something that Peter was saying, which I think is actually a crucial point. We are ultimately being driven by the decision of the president to make a calculation between whether we want land or the constitution. The country should never be put to that election, because we want both the constitution and the land. And hence it's crucial to first explore what the framework of the constitution is. And the choice that we are being forced to make by the entire political class, by the way, not just President Ramaphosa, but the entire political class, is a very difficult choice, because it's the choice whether we want rights or land. And no nation should be put into that choice.
Absolutely. What a fantastic way to end that conversation. Thank you so much to Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi. Next up, the week ahead.